Get out, tonight, and don't you dare touch anything that isn't yours." Nathan Caldwell grabbed his wife's wrist and dragged her to the front door. He shoved the divorce papers against her chest so hard she stumbled backward into the wall. "You have nothing," he said, his voice low and sharp as broken glass. "You came here with nothing. You leave with nothing. Tonight." He turned to security and pointed at Claire like she was furniture to be removed. 7 years of marriage, and he couldn't even look her in the eyes when he destroyed her. If this story moved something in you, if you believe that quiet people are sometimes carrying the loudest storms, please subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment right now and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The penthouse on the 52nd floor of the Caldwell Tower smelled like expensive candles and fresh flowers. Claire had put those flowers there herself that morning. White peonies, Nathan's favorite, even though he hadn't noticed them in at least 2 years. She was still holding her coat when he walked in. She had been waiting for him. That was the thing no one would ever know about Claire Bennett. She was always waiting, waiting for a kind word, waiting for him to look at her the way he used to in the beginning, waiting for the man she married to come back from wherever he had disappeared to. Nathan didn't look at the flowers. He didn't look at her coat. He walked straight to the bar, poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon, and placed a thick manila envelope on the marble countertop without a word. Claire stared at it. "What is that?" she asked. "You know what it is," he said. She crossed the room slowly. Her fingers touched the edge of the envelope the way you touch something you're not sure is real. She opened it. 3 pages of legal language, crisp and cold, stamped with the seal of King County Superior Court. Divorce papers. Her throat closed. Not because she was shocked. She wasn't shocked. She was devastated in the specific, particular way that comes when something you've been quietly dreading for 2 years finally arrives at your door and knocks like it owns the place. "Nathan," she said. "Don't," he said immediately. Just that one word. "Don't." "Don't what?" "Don't speak. Don't feel. Don't remind him that she was a human being who had spent 7 years building a life around his." She looked at him. Really looked at him, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to see what was actually standing in front of her. Nathan Caldwell was 41 years old. He was handsome in the way that men who have never been told no tend to be polished, certain, comfortable inside his own skin. He was wearing the dark gray suit she had picked out for him last spring. She remembered choosing it because she thought the color made his eyes look kind. She had been wrong about a lot of things. "I want you to be gone by 9 o'clock, he said. He turned slightly, looking past her shoulder toward the window, toward the Seattle skyline, glittering in the dark and the rain. "Security will help you with whatever you need to carry out." "Whatever I need to carry out," she repeated slowly. "Read the prenup, Claire. You know what it says." She did know. She had read it when they signed it 7 years ago at a small table in a lawyer's office on a Wednesday afternoon. At the time, it had felt like a formality. At the time, Nathan had held her hand while she read through it and told her it was just something his father's attorney had insisted on, that it meant nothing, that it would never matter. It said she left with what she came with. And what Claire had come with 7 years ago was almost nothing. A library science degree, a job at a small community library in Queen Anne, a savings account with $11,000 in it, and a battered suitcase her mother had given her before she moved to Seattle. That was what he believed. That was the entirety of what Nathan Caldwell believed Claire Bennett to be. She set the divorce papers back on the counter with great care. Her hands weren't shaking. She was surprised to find that her hands weren't shaking. "Is there someone else?" she asked. A long pause. She watched his jaw move slightly and knew the answer before he said a word. "That doesn't need to be part of this conversation," he said. "It absolutely does. Claire. Is there someone else, Nathan? I want you to say it out loud. I want to hear you say it." He turned to look at her then. For just a moment, something moved across his face that might have been guilt. It might have been pity. She couldn't tell the difference anymore. "Victoria and I have been seeing each other for several months," he said. "She's pregnant. I'm asking you to do this with dignity." The word dignity hit her like a physical thing. This man who had told her for 3 years that the reason they hadn't had children yet was because the timing was wrong, the business was demanding, the moment wasn't right. This man was asking her to leave with dignity because his pregnant girlfriend was waiting in the wings. Victoria Hayes, 28 years old, his personal assistant for the last 2 years. Claire had met her at the company Christmas party. She had seemed sweet. Claire had complimented her earrings. She almost laughed. She didn't, but she almost did. "How long have you been planning this?" Claire asked. "That's not—" "How long, Nathan?" He set his glass down. "Several months, I told you." "No," she said. Her voice was quiet, but there was something underneath it now, something that hadn't been there a minute ago. "I mean, how long have you been planning for me to walk out of here with nothing? How long have you been sitting on those papers? How long have you been building this little scene in your head, me standing here, you handing me the envelope, security waiting downstairs?" Something shifted in his expression. "You're being dramatic." "I want an answer." "The answer doesn't matter." "It matters to me." He picked up his glass again. "You'll have whatever you need to get back on your feet. I'm not heartless. I'll have a check sent through the attorneys." "A check," she said. "A reasonable amount. Enough to—" "Nathan." She stopped him. Her voice had gone very quiet. "I don't want your check." He blinked. He had expected tears by now. He had expected begging maybe, or at minimum the kind of desperate bargaining that he had rehearsed responses for. He had not expected her to be standing there looking at him with that particular expression. Not anger exactly, not grief exactly, something that looked uncomfortably like clarity. "You should read the prenup again," he said, "because it's very clear." "I've read it," she said. "I remember every word of it." "Then you know what your options are." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked to the bedroom. He heard her open the closet. He heard the familiar sound of the old suitcase being pulled from the top shelf, the one she'd had since before they were married, the battered brown one with the broken zipper on the small pocket. He poured another bourbon. He told himself she would come back out crying and asking for more time. That was how he had imagined this going. She would cry, and he would be patient and firm, and eventually she would accept the reality of the situation, and they would part ways quietly, and he could move forward with the life he actually wanted. But she didn't come back out crying. She came back out calm. She was wearing her old coat, the olive green one she'd had for years, not the expensive one he'd bought her last Christmas. The old suitcase was in her hand. She had changed into flat shoes. "I'll need you to have my book sent to an address I'll provide later," she said. "The ones in the second bedroom. All of them. You can keep everything else." "Claire." "The fern on the windowsill too, please. I've had that plant for 6 years." He stared at her. "You're leaving right now." "You gave me until 9, she said. "I'll be out in 20 minutes. She walked to the front closet and took her rain jacket from the hook. She checked the pockets of her coat. She picked up her phone from the entryway table. She did all of this with the methodical calm of a woman who had already made peace with something. He called down to security. He told them to assist Mrs. Caldwell with her exit and to ensure that only the items already in her possession left the building. I used the word ensure. He heard himself say it and felt something like relief. He had been afraid this would be messier. When the elevator doors closed and she was gone, Nathan Caldwell poured himself a third bourbon and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city he had built himself inside. He had no idea that he had just made the single most catastrophic mistake of his professional and personal life. I had no idea that the woman in the elevator, the quiet, steady, ordinary woman he had just thrown out of his home in the rain, was not who he thought she was, not even close. The lobby of the Caldwell Tower was all glass and polished stone. Claire walked through it without looking at the security guard who held the door. She walked through it without stopping. She walked out into the rain. Seattle in November felt like being underwater. The cold came from everywhere at once, from the sidewalk, from the wind off the sound, from the dark sky dropping its weight down on the city block by block. She stood on the sidewalk outside the building and let the rain hit her face for a moment. She didn't move. People walked around her on the sidewalk, heads down, collars up, moving fast, the way people move in rain. Nobody stopped. Nobody looked. She was just a woman standing in the rain with a suitcase. That was all she was to this city right now. She reached out and grabbed a taxi. The driver, a middle-aged man with a radio playing low and a pine tree air freshener hanging from the mirror, looked at her in the rearview mirror as she got in. "Where to?" he asked. And Claire realized she had no idea. She had lived in Nathan's penthouse for 4 years. Before that, they had shared a condo in Capitol Hill. Before that, she had her own apartment in Queen Anne. All of those places were gone now. Nathan owned them all in one way or another. She had no family in Seattle. No close friends she had kept up with properly since the marriage. Nathan had always preferred they socialize with his circle, and somehow over the years her own circle had quietly fallen away. She thought of hotels. She had $37 in cash and the credit card Nathan had already texted to say would be canceled by morning. She thought of her colleague Janet from the library, but they hadn't spoken in 8 months. She thought of the number. Her fingers went to the hidden pocket of her old suitcase, the small interior compartment with the broken zipper that nobody ever looked inside, and found the folded piece of paper she had carried for years without ever opening. On it was a phone number and a single line in her own handwriting. "Only if everything falls apart." She stared at it. "Miss," the driver said, "you all right?" "I'm fine," she said automatically. "Take me downtown, please, anywhere." He drove. The radio played something slow and old. The windshield wipers moved back and forth. Claire sat in the back seat of the taxi with the piece of paper in her hands and thought about the life she had built and the choice she had made and the girl she used to be before she made that choice. 10 years ago, Claire Whitmore had walked away from everything. She had been 22 years old. She had just finished her master's degree in library science. She had come home to the family estate in Connecticut for the holidays, and she had sat across the dinner table from her father and her older brother and looked at the life waiting for her, the board positions and the charity galas and the carefully managed image and the expectations stacked up like fine china, and she had felt something close to suffocation. "I want to do something real," she had told her brother Adrian. Adrian had looked at her across the table with those steady dark eyes he'd always had. He was 29, then already running divisions of the family corporation, already being groomed for the CEO role he would take before he was 35. He understood ambition, he understood legacy, but he also understood his sister in the specific way that older brothers sometimes understand the people they grew up watching. "What does real mean to you?" he had asked. "I want to build a life that belongs to me," she said. "Not to the name, not to the money. I want to find out if I'm actually worth something on my own." She had asked him not to tell people who she was. She had asked him to let her go be someone ordinary. He had agreed. He had told her he would give her space. He had told her she had 3 years, and if she needed him, she only had to call. 3 years had become 10. She had moved to Seattle. She had gotten a job at the Queen Anne Community Library, and she had loved it genuinely, completely loved it in a way that surprised her. She loved the smell of the books and the quiet, and the way the afternoon light came through the windows, and the regulars who came in and asked for specific things and trusted her to find them. She loved being good at something that had nothing to do with her last name. She met Nathan at a library fundraiser. Ironic, she would later think. He was charming. He was warm and funny, and he looked at her like she was the most interesting person in the room. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know she was anything other than the librarian who had organized the event. He loved her, she believed. For a while she believed that completely. She married him as Claire Bennett, her mother's maiden name. She kept her past quiet, not out of deception, but out of a deep-seated need she had never fully been able to explain. She wanted to be chosen for herself. She wanted to know that what they were building was real. She had wanted real, and now she was sitting in the back of a taxi in the November rain with $37 and a broken suitcase, and the realization that the real life she had built was gone. She unfolded the piece of paper. She dialed the number. It rang twice. "Who is this?" The voice was deep, alert. It was late, but he didn't sound like a man who had been sleeping. "Adrian," she said. A pause, long enough that she thought the call might have dropped. "Claire." Not a question. Flat, careful. "I need—" She stopped. The words caught. She had promised herself she would be calm, but the sound of his voice broke something open in her chest that she hadn't known was still capable of breaking. "I need help." "Where are you?" "Seattle, downtown. I'm in a cab." "Are you safe?" "Yes, I'm safe. I'm just—" She looked out the rain-streaked window. "I have nowhere to go." She heard movement. She heard what she thought was a door. She heard him speaking to someone in a low voice. "Tell the driver to take you to the Four Seasons on Union Street," he said. "The reservation will be under Whitmore. Go inside. Order food. Get warm. I'm getting on a plane." "Adrian, you don't need to—" "Claire." His voice didn't change. It was calm, the way deep water is calm, not still, not empty, but deep enough that the surface doesn't show what's moving underneath. "I'm getting on a plane. Stop arguing with me." She stopped arguing. The cab pulled up in front of the Four Seasons 11 minutes later. She walked to the front desk. She gave the name Whitmore. The desk clerk looked at his screen. Something shifted in his expression, professional controlled, but she caught it. The small recalibration that happens when a name means something. "Of course, Ms. Whitmore," he said. "We have a suite prepared. Will you be needing anything this evening?" She thought about it. "Yes," she said. "I'm going to need a phone charger and something to eat, and," she paused, "a very strong cup of coffee." She was sitting at the suite's dining table, wrapped in a hotel robe with a plate of food half-eaten in front of her, when she finally opened the suitcase all the way. Not the hidden pocket that was done. She had made the call, but the main compartment which she now went through slowly and carefully. She had packed in 20 minutes without planning. She had grabbed what she reached for first, and sitting at this table, sorting through what she had brought with her, she understood something about herself. She had brought no jewelry, no expensive clothes, no thing Nathan had given her. She had brought her degrees. She had brought her personal files. She had brought a small framed photograph of herself and Adrian from years ago. She had brought from the bottom of the closet where she kept things that were hers, before anything was his, a small leather notebook she had used as a journal in her 20s. She held the notebook in her hands for a moment. Then she set it aside and pulled out her laptop and opened her email and began doing what she did when she needed to understand something. She started reading. She started reading the prenuptial agreement, not with the eyes of a woman who had signed it in good faith on a Wednesday afternoon, believing it would never matter. With the eyes of a woman whose brother was somewhere above the American continent right now flying toward her, and who needed to understand exactly what the battlefield looked like before he landed. She read for 3 hours. By the time she heard the knock at the suite door at 6:15 in the morning, she had read the prenup 3 times. She had read the accompanying financial disclosure documents that had been filed at the time of the marriage. She had read them carefully, with the focus of someone who had grown up watching her father review financial documents at the breakfast table, and who had absorbed more about corporate structure and financial architecture than she had ever let Nathan see. And she had found something that made her set down her coffee cup very slowly and stare at the wall for a long moment before she went back and read it again. She went to the door. She opened it. Adrian Whitmore was 6'1", broad-shouldered, and was wearing a suit that probably cost more than Nathan Caldwell's monthly car payment. He had dark circles under his eyes from the red-eye flight. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee from the lobby. He looked at his sister. She looked at her brother. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then she stepped back from the door, and he walked in and set the coffees down and put his arms around her and held her, the way older brothers hold younger sisters when the world has done something unforgivable and there are no words big enough to address it yet. She didn't cry. She had spent the night past crying. "Tell me everything," he said. So she did. She started at the beginning. Not the night Nathan handed her the envelope. She started years back at the signs. She had explained away the moments. She had minimized the times she had told herself it was her imagination, or her sensitivity, or her fault. She talked for a long time. Adrian sat across from her and drank his coffee and listened with the complete attention of a man who understood that the most important thing he could do right now was exactly this: listen. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Victoria Hayes," he said. "His assistant, 28, apparently several months pregnant. And he used the prenup to try to send you out with nothing. That's what he believes it does." Adrian looked at her. "But you read it again last night." "I did. And," she turned her laptop toward him, "the prenup does require me to leave with what I came with," she said. "What Nathan seems to have forgotten or possibly never knew, because I never told him, is what I actually came with." Adrian looked at the screen. He was quiet for a moment. "You never disclosed your personal assets when you married him." "No, he never asked. I listed the checking account, the apartment lease, the student loans. I listed what Claire Bennett had. I didn't list what Claire Whitmore had, because at the time I was trying very hard not to be Claire Whitmore." "And what did Claire Whitmore have?" She met his eyes. "The trust fund turned over on my 25th birthday, Adrian. I never touched it. I never touched any of it. It's been sitting in a managed account for 8 years. Adrian set his coffee cup down very carefully. "Claire," he said slowly, "that account has grown considerably, yes." A long pause. "How considerably?" She told him the number. Adrian Whitmore had been running a multi-billion-dollar corporation for 7 years. He had sat across the table from some of the most powerful people in the business world. He had negotiated deals that moved markets. He was not a man who showed surprise easily. He showed it now, not dramatically, just a slight widening of the eyes, a brief pause before he said anything. "Nathan tried to send you out with nothing," he said quietly, "when according to the prenup's own logic, you entered that marriage with significantly more than he did." "Significantly more," she confirmed. Adrian looked at the table. He looked at his sister. And then he said something she hadn't expected. "There's more," he said. "I didn't come here just with a plane ticket." She waited. "I've been watching Nathan Caldwell's business for the last 3 years," Adrian said. She stared at him. "What? You were married to him. I'm your brother. I run a corporation. You think I wasn't going to have someone keeping a very light, very discreet eye on the man who had access to my family's future?" He held up a hand when she opened her mouth. "I never interfered. I never reached out. I respected your privacy and your choices completely, but I paid attention." "Adrian, let me finish." His voice was even. "What I found over 3 years is that Nathan Caldwell's business is not what it appears to be. The image of the successful real estate developer. It's a very sophisticated construction. His company carries debt that isn't publicly visible. He's made acquisitions that don't make economic sense, unless you understand that he was using those assets to obscure losses in other parts of the portfolio. He's been operating on leverage that would terrify any serious investor who looked closely." Claire stared at him. "How close to the edge is he?" she asked. "Close enough," Adrian said, "that the wrong question asked in the wrong courtroom could accelerate things significantly." She understood what he was telling her. Nathan had handed her papers and told her she was leaving with nothing. He had believed that because he believed she was nothing. But the man who had spent 7 years presenting himself as a successful, stable businessman was standing on ice that was much thinner than anyone knew. And she had an older brother who knew exactly where to press. Outside the suite windows, Seattle was going gray with early morning. The rain had stopped somewhere in the night. The city was waking up slow and wet and ordinary. Claire Whitmore picked up her coffee cup. She thought about the girl who had come to the city wanting to build a real life. She thought about the library and the white peonies that were still sitting in a vase in the penthouse nobody had asked her about. She thought about 7 years of waiting for a man to see her, and a single night of finally being told clearly and without ambiguity that he never had. She thought about what real meant. "I don't want to destroy him," she said. Adrian looked at her. "I mean it," she said. "I'm not interested in revenge. I'm not interested in burning everything down." "I know," he said, "but I will not leave that courtroom with less than what I came with." "No," he agreed, "you won't. And if he's been hiding things that hurt other people, then those people deserve to know." She nodded. She set the coffee cup down. 3 days, she said. "The hearing is in 3 days." "I know," Adrian said. "I already spoke to our attorneys on the flight. They're flying in tonight." She looked at her brother, this man who had let her disappear for 10 years because she had needed to, who had watched from a distance and trusted her to find her own way, who had gotten on a plane in the middle of the night because she called him and said she needed help. "I'm sorry I didn't call sooner," she said. He shook his head once. "Don't. I should have—" "Claire." He looked at her directly. "You needed to find out who you were without the name. You found out. Now we use the name." She almost smiled. Outside Seattle was fully light now. The day was beginning. In 3 days, Nathan Caldwell would walk into King County Superior Court believing he had already won. He had no idea that the woman he had put in a taxi with $37 was sitting in a hotel suite right now, drinking coffee with the CEO of one of America's most powerful corporations. He had no idea what was coming, and that was entirely his own fault, because he had never once in 7 years thought to ask who Claire Bennett truly was. The attorneys arrived at the Four Seasons at 9:17 that same morning. There were 4 of them. Claire heard them before she saw them, the sound of rolling briefcases on marble, the low, controlled murmur of people who spoke in boardrooms for a living and never raised their voices because they never needed to. Adrian had called them somewhere over the Midwest on his red-eye flight, and they had driven through the night from a firm in Portland that Whitmore Global Holdings kept on permanent retainer for exactly the kind of situation where money and law needed to move fast in the same direction. The lead attorney was a woman named Margaret Cho. She was 61 years old, silver-haired, and she walked into the hotel suite and looked at Claire with the precise, assessing gaze of someone who was already calculating outcomes before she'd sat down. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said. "Ms. Whitmore," Claire corrected quietly. Margaret Cho paused, a small pause. Then she nodded once, and something in her expression shifted a professional recalibration, the way a navigator adjusts course when new coordinates come in. "Ms. Whitmore," she said, "tell me everything your husband's attorneys don't know," Claire told her. It took 2 hours. Margaret's team spread documents across the suite's dining table, the prenuptial agreement, the financial disclosure forms, the asset statements. 2 of the junior attorneys worked laptops. One took handwritten notes in a leather binder. Margaret herself sat perfectly still and listened with the kind of focused attention that costs $700 an hour and is worth every cent of it. When Claire finished, Margaret looked at Adrian. "The prenup is actually her strongest asset," Margaret said. "He wrote it to protect himself. He didn't know he needed to protect himself from her." Adrian nodded. He had been standing near the window the entire time, arms crossed, saying very little. That was the thing people who didn't know Adrian Whitmore tended to misunderstand about him. They expected the CEO of a company that size to fill every room with his presence, to dominate conversations, to perform power. Adrian didn't perform anything. He simply was what he was, quietly, completely, in a way that made other people feel slightly off balance without knowing exactly why. "What's the strongest move?" he asked. Margaret looked at her notes. "We file for full asset disclosure immediately. We request that the court review the financial records Nathan submitted at the time of the prenuptial agreement. If those records were incomplete or inaccurate, which based on what you've described, Mr. Whitmore, they may well have been, then the prenup itself becomes legally questionable." Claire looked up. "Questionable how?" "A prenuptial agreement signed under conditions of financial misrepresentation can be challenged," Margaret said. "It doesn't automatically void it, but it gives us significant leverage. Combined with the fact that your own disclosed assets at the time of signing were not fully represented again, not fraudulently, you simply didn't list what you hadn't chosen to claim. The picture becomes considerably more complex than Mr. Caldwell's attorneys are currently prepared for." She paused. "He walked into this believing it was simple," Margaret said. "He believed you had no resources, no representation, and no leverage. He was wrong on all 3 counts. That gap between what he believes and what is actually true is where we work." Claire sat back in her chair. Something was settling in her chest. Not peace exactly, not yet, but the beginning of something that would become peace. The specific feeling of standing on solid ground after a long time, standing on something that shifted under your feet. "How much time do we have?" she asked. "The initial hearing is 3 days from now," Margaret said. "We won't resolve everything in 3 days, but we can do enough in 3 days to make very clear to Nathan Caldwell and his attorneys that this is not the case they thought they were litigating." Adrian spoke from the window. "What do you need from me?" Margaret looked at him. "I need everything you have on Caldwell's business operations. Financial records, acquisition history, debt structure. Anything your team has compiled. I need it in the next 12 hours. Adrian pulled out his phone and made a call. He said 4 sentences. He ended the call. "You'll have it in 6, he said. Margaret nodded. She began gathering her papers. "Ms. Whitmore," she said, pausing at the door. "One more thing. When you walk into that courtroom in 3 days, I need you to understand something. This is not going to be comfortable. Nathan's attorneys will attempt to characterize you. They will use the quiet life you chose, the library job, the apparent simplicity of your existence. They will try to make that look like lack of substance. You need to be prepared for that." Claire looked at her steadily. "I worked at a community library for years because I loved it," she said. "I helped people find things they needed. I showed up every day, and I did it well. If his attorneys want to use that against me, they're welcome to try." Margaret Cho almost smiled. Almost. "Good," she said. And then she left. The room was quieter without them. Adrian came away from the window and sat down across from Claire. He looked at the documents still spread across the table. He looked at his sister. "You should sleep," he said. "I'm not tired." Claire. "I'm genuinely not tired, Adrian. I feel—" She stopped. She thought about the word. "Awake. I feel completely awake for the first time in a very long time." He was quiet for a moment. "When did you know?" he asked. That the marriage was wrong. Not last night. When did you actually know? She considered the question seriously, the way she had always considered questions seriously, which was one of the things about her that Nathan had called a quirk early in the marriage and later called exhausting. 3 years ago, she said, maybe 3.5. There was a moment we were at a dinner, one of his business dinners, and someone asked me something about my opinion on something I don't even remember what, some local issue. And Nathan laughed. Not a mean laugh, not then, just a dismissive one, like my having an opinion was a charming but slightly ridiculous notion. She was quiet for a moment, and I looked at him across the table and I thought, he doesn't know me. He's never known me. He loves an idea of me that fits neatly into the life he's building, and the actual person sitting across from him is completely invisible to him. Adrian didn't say anything. He was watching her the way he had always watched her, with attention that was entirely without judgment. And I stayed anyway, she said, because I'd built something, because I thought it was real even if he didn't see all of it, because walking away felt like failing. It wasn't failing, Adrian said. I know that now. She looked at her hands on the table. But I needed last night to know it. I needed him to throw those papers at me in my own home to finally understand that staying wasn't love. It was just fear dressed up to look like something else. Adrian reached across the table and put his hand briefly over hers. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Some things between people who grew up together don't need words. They sat there for a moment in the early morning quiet of the hotel suite. Then Claire said, "Tell me what else you found about Nathan's business, all of it." And Adrian told her. He told her for 90 minutes. He spoke carefully and specifically the way he always spoke about financial matters. No wasted words, no dramatic language, just facts laid in order, like stones across water. He had a team of analysts who monitored market activity in sectors where Whitmore Global Holdings had interests. Nathan's real estate company had moved into several of those sectors in the last 4 years. The monitoring had been, as Adrian had said, light and discreet. But what it had turned up was a pattern. Nathan Caldwell had been acquiring properties using debt financing structured in ways that were technically legal, but deeply aggressive. He had taken on leverage that made sense only if the market continued to move in a very specific direction. When the market had not moved in that direction, when interest rates had shifted and 2 key development projects had stalled, he had made a series of transactions that moved losses from one part of the corporate structure to another, keeping the public-facing numbers clean while the actual financial health of the company quietly deteriorated. None of this was visible to a casual observer. It wouldn't be visible to a reporter, or to most investors, or to the kind of person who read the business section and saw Nathan Caldwell quoted confidently about his company's growth. It was visible to Adrian Whitmore, because Adrian Whitmore had spent his entire adult life learning to read corporate structures the way other people read sentences. He could look at a balance sheet and hear what it was actually saying underneath the numbers, the way a doctor can look at an X-ray and see what the patient can't feel yet. What the balance sheet was saying about Caldwell Real Estate Group was not good. "How exposed is he?" Claire asked. "If someone with standing to request a full financial audit were to do so in a legal proceeding," Adrian said carefully, "and if that audit were to become part of the public court record, the resulting scrutiny would likely trigger responses from his lenders. 2 of his major creditors have covenant clauses that allow them to call their loans if certain financial metrics fall below specific thresholds. Right now, those metrics are being managed carefully, aggressively, but managed. Public scrutiny of the underlying numbers would make that management significantly harder." Claire processed this. "So the divorce proceeding, if it involves financial disclosure, becomes the lever," Adrian said. She looked at him. "I don't want to destroy him, Adrian. I said that this morning and I meant it." "I know. But I will not be his victim." "No," he said, "you won't. And if there are people investors, employees, business partners who are operating on a false picture of what his company actually is, they have a right to a true picture," Adrian said simply. She nodded. "Then we let the process work," she said. "We don't push harder than the truth requires. We just don't let him hide behind it anymore." Adrian looked at his sister across the table, and for a moment he saw the 22-year-old who had sat across a dinner table in Connecticut and told him she wanted to build something real. She had built something real. It just hadn't been what either of them expected. "Sleep," he said again. "You have 3 days, and you're going to need to be sharp." This time she didn't argue. She slept for 6 hours. When she woke, there were 3 messages from Nathan's attorney on her old cell phone, increasingly formal, increasingly pointed, asking for confirmation that she had received the divorce documentation and requesting she retain counsel immediately. There was also a text from Nathan himself. She stared at it for a long moment before she opened it. It said, "I know this is hard. I hope you're okay. Please don't make this difficult." She set the phone face down on the bedside table and went to shower. Don't make this difficult. She thought about that phrase while the hot water ran. She thought about what it revealed about the way Nathan's mind worked, the assumption that difficulty, if it came, would come from her. That she was the variable, that she was the potential problem, the possibility that he had constructed a situation that was itself the problem, that the difficulty was built into the thing he had done and not into her response to it, did not appear to have occurred to him. She was stepping out of the shower when her phone buzzed again. Not her old phone, the new one Adrian had left on the desk, a clean device registered to a Whitmore corporate account that his assistant had delivered that afternoon. It was Adrian. "Margaret's team found something," he said without preamble. She stopped moving. "What?" "The financial disclosure Nathan submitted when the prenuptial agreement was signed. His attorneys filed it as a standard asset declaration. Standard is a generous word. Margaret's team spent the night going through it. There are assets missing." She sat down on the edge of the bed. "What kind of assets?" "A holding company, small, structured to be quiet. At the time of your marriage, Nathan was a partial owner. It wasn't disclosed in the prenup documentation. He hid an asset. He appears to have not mentioned it. Whether that rises to the level of deliberate misrepresentation or sloppy preparation by his attorneys is something for the court to determine. But the effect is the same. The financial picture he presented when you signed that agreement was incomplete." Claire was quiet for a moment. "If his picture was incomplete," she said slowly, "and my picture was incomplete, then the prenuptial agreement was signed by 2 parties who were not working from full information," Adrian said. "And that is a very different legal situation from the one he believes he's in." She heard something in the background on his end of the call, voices movement. "Where are you?" she asked. "Downstairs. Margaret's team is here. We're working." "Adrian," she paused. "What does this actually mean for the hearing in 3 days?" "It means that Nathan's attorneys are going to walk into that courtroom believing they have a clean, simple prenup that sends you out the door with nothing. And Margaret is going to hand them a document that demonstrates the prenup was signed under conditions of incomplete disclosure on his side, which combined with your own undisclosed assets creates a situation that is so legally complicated that any judge with half a brain is going to order a full financial review before they sign off on anything. And the full financial review becomes part of the court record," Adrian said. "Public." She understood. Nathan had built his entire life on a carefully maintained image. The image of the successful developer. The image of the man who had made himself. The image that filled the business press mentions and the charity gala programs and the LinkedIn profile with 6,000 followers. A public court proceeding with full financial disclosure in which the real architecture of his business was examined by court-appointed reviewers. That was not something his image would survive intact. "He doesn't know," she said. "He has no idea," Adrian confirmed. "He's been dealing with a librarian. He thinks he's dealing with a librarian." She almost smiled. "I'll be down in 20 minutes, she said. She was down in 15. The suite's living room had transformed. The dining table was covered in documents again, organized, tabbed, flagged in multiple colors. Margaret and 2 of her associates were working at laptops. An analyst Claire hadn't met before was on a video call with someone she couldn't see speaking in low, rapid sentences. Adrian handed her a coffee when she walked in and said nothing. She took it and moved to the table and started reading. For the next 18 hours, Claire Whitmore worked. She read documents. She answered Margaret's questions. She walked Margaret and her team through the full history of the marriage finances, not the surface history, not the story of the joint account and the household expenses, but the deep history, the things she knew because she had grown up in a family where financial literacy was treated as fundamental as reading. She told them about the time she had noticed things in Nathan's company statements that didn't quite add up and had asked about them and been told she was misreading. She told them about the restructuring 2 years ago that Nathan had described to her in terms that she had realized at the time, but said nothing about, didn't quite match what she knew restructuring actually looked like in practice. Margaret listened. Her team wrote. By the following evening, they had a document that was, as Margaret described it, with professional understatement, thorough. "I want to be clear about something," Margaret said on the second night when the team had taken a break, and it was just the three of them, Margaret, Adrian, Claire, sitting around the table with cold coffee and the organized wreckage of 2 days of intense preparation. "I want to be clear that what we're doing here is not aggressive beyond what the facts support," Margaret said. "We are presenting true information in a legal proceeding. We are not manufacturing anything. We are not exaggerating. Every single document we put in front of that judge is factual, verified, and directly relevant to the question of what was known by each party at the time the prenuptial agreement was signed." "I know," Claire said. "I'm telling you this," Margaret said, "because when you walk into that courtroom tomorrow, Nathan's attorneys are going to try to characterize this differently. They're going to suggest that you have brought in resources from outside, and they will make that sound like an ambush. They will try to make Adrian's presence feel like something predatory, like you waited and plotted." "She had $37 and a broken suitcase," Adrian said very quietly. "I know that," Margaret said. "The judge will know that, but you need to be prepared for the characterization anyway." Claire looked at her. "What would you like me to do?" "Walk in calm," Margaret said. "Walk in completely, absolutely calm. Don't react to anything his attorneys say. Don't react to anything Nathan does. You are there to provide facts. Let the facts do what they do." Claire nodded. "One more thing," Margaret said. She hesitated, and that hesitation was notable because Margaret Cho was not someone who hesitated. "Victoria Hayes." Claire was quiet. "She will likely be present," Margaret said, "or Nathan may choose to have her absent to avoid complication. Either way, her existence and the pregnancy are part of the record given Nathan's own disclosure in his communication to you. I want to know how you want to handle that element." Claire thought about Victoria Hayes, 28 years old, pregnant, probably told a version of this story that cast her as the love Nathan had finally found the reason he'd had the courage to end an unhappy marriage, the woman who was going to get the future he'd been promising. She thought about what it felt like to be the woman believing those promises. "She's not my problem," Claire said finally. "She's not the one who made vows to me. She's not the one who signed those documents. Whatever she believed or was told, that's between her and Nathan. I don't want her mentioned unless it's legally necessary, and I don't want anyone in that room treating her as though she's the villain. She's a 28-year-old woman who got mixed up with a man who lies. That's not a crime." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. "All right," she said. The morning of the hearing, Claire was up at 5. She sat at the suite's window with coffee and watched the city come awake below her. She thought about the library, about whether Janet was covering her shifts, about the regulars who came in on Thursday mornings, about the fern on the windowsill that she had asked Nathan to have sent to her and that she suspected was already dead. She thought about all the ordinary things that made up the life she had actually been living underneath the life Nathan saw when he looked at her. She thought about what she wanted to happen today. Not to win. Winning felt like the wrong word, the wrong frame, the wrong way to think about what a court proceeding was. She wanted the truth to be in the room. She wanted the full, complete, unedited truth to sit in that courtroom where people could look at it clearly. She wanted the version of events Nathan had written, in which he was the successful man generously offering his simple wife a fair exit to dissolve in the light of what was actually real. That was what she wanted. She got dressed carefully. The suit she had chosen with Margaret's input, not expensive in a way that was showy, but clearly well made. Dark navy, clean lines, the kind of thing a woman wears when she wants to be taken seriously and knows she will be. She was pulling on her jacket when her phone buzzed. It was a number she didn't recognize. She answered. "Claire," Nathan's voice. No attorney voice, no formal, careful language. Just Nathan with something raw underneath the word. She was so surprised that she almost didn't speak. "Nathan," she said finally, "I need you to listen to me." He was speaking fast. "I don't know what you've done or who you've brought in, but my attorneys are telling me things have gotten complicated, and I need you to hear me out before we go into that room today." "I'm listening," she said. "We can settle this privately," he said. "Whatever you need, more than the prenup, significantly more. I'll have my attorneys call Margaret Cho." He stopped. He'd said the name, and now he knew she knew he'd been asking around. "I just need this to be quiet, Claire. I need you to understand that what happens in that courtroom today affects more than just us. There are employees. There are investors. There are people who— Nathan, she said. He stopped. You had $37 worth of consideration for all of that, she said, when you had security remove me from the building. Silence. See you in court, she said. She hung up. She finished buttoning her jacket. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door of the suite and opened it, and Adrian was standing in the hallway, already suited, coffee in hand, with the particular expression he wore when he was preparing for something he intended to win. Ready, he said. She thought about 7 years. She thought about white peonies nobody noticed. She thought about a woman who had wanted real and had found out finally exactly what was real and what wasn't. Yes, she said. They walked to the elevator together. Margaret and her team were in the lobby. The cars were waiting outside. The city was gray and sharp and awake. In less than 2 hours, Nathan Caldwell would walk into King County Superior Court, expecting the easiest morning of a complicated week. He would not get it. And every single thing that happened next would be entirely the consequence of a decision he had made 3 days ago, standing at a marble bar with a bourbon in his hand, watching a woman in an olive green coat walk to an elevator with a broken suitcase. The decision to believe that quiet meant powerless, that ordinary meant nothing, that Claire Bennett was exactly what she appeared to be. He had never been more wrong about anything in his life. The cars pulled up to King County Superior Court at 8:47 in the morning. Claire stepped out first. She didn't wait for anyone to open her door. She didn't look around to see if anyone was watching. She simply stepped out onto the sidewalk and stood up straight and walked toward the entrance like a woman who had been deciding to do this for 3 days and had finished deciding. Adrian was behind her. Margaret and her 3 associates fanned out in a formation that was professional and precise without looking rehearsed. The 5th member of the legal team, a financial forensics specialist named David Park, who had flown in from New York the previous afternoon and had spent the night reviewing documents with Margaret, carried a briefcase that contained, as Claire understood it, the kind of numbers that would change the temperature in a room. They went through security. They walked down a corridor that smelled like floor wax and institutional coffee and the particular quiet of a building where serious things happen to ordinary people every day. A court officer directed them to courtroom 7 on the 3rd floor. Margaret put her hand briefly on Claire's arm before they went through the doors. "Remember what I told you," she said quietly. "Walk in calm," Claire said. "Walk in completely calm." Claire nodded. She pushed the door open. Nathan was already there. He was sitting at the respondents' table with 2 attorneys, Daniel Mercer, the senior partner of the firm he had used for 5 years, and a younger associate whose name Claire didn't know. Nathan was wearing a charcoal suit, and his face had the careful, composed expression of a man who had been coached on exactly what expression to wear. He was talking to Mercer in a low voice when the door opened. He turned. He looked at Claire. He looked at the suit she was wearing, the navy one, the well-made one, and something shifted in his face. A small shift, barely visible. But Claire had spent 7 years reading Nathan Caldwell's face, and she caught it. Then he looked past her. He saw Margaret Cho and her team. His jaw tightened slightly. Then he saw Adrian. Nathan Caldwell was not a man who lost his composure easily. He had built a career on projecting certainty in rooms full of skeptical people. He had sat across from banks and investors and city planning committees and held the line on his confidence like it was load-bearing. I was good at it. It was possibly the thing he was best at. But in the moment he recognized Adrian Whitmore, the recognition moving across his face slowly like someone working out a math problem because the person standing in a Seattle courtroom couldn't be who it looked like, couldn't possibly be something cracked in the performance. Not dramatically, not in the way it would crack in a movie. Just a subtle, terrible shift behind his eyes, like a man who has just understood that the ground he is standing on is not what he thought it was. Mercer leaned toward him and said something. Nathan said something back without looking away from Adrian. Mercer turned and looked. Claire watched the senior attorney take in Adrian Whitmore's presence with the controlled professional alarm of a man recalculating everything about the morning he had planned. Claire sat down at the petitioner's table and opened her folder and did not look at Nathan again. The judge entered at 9:03. Honorable Susan Reeves was 64 years old, had been on the bench for 19 years, and had, according to Margaret, approximately 0 patience for people who wasted her time or misrepresented facts in her courtroom. She sat down, arranged her papers, looked at both tables, and said, "Good morning, let's begin." Mercer went first. He laid out Nathan's position with the smooth confidence of a man who had done this 1,000 times. The prenuptial agreement was clear. The marriage had irreconcilably broken down. Nathan was requesting the court honor the terms of the agreement, as written, a clean division with each party, leaving with what they had disclosed at the time of signing. He spoke for 11 minutes. He cited case law. He was polished, thorough, and utterly certain. Judge Reeves listened without expression. Then she looked at Margaret. "Counsel for the petitioner." Margaret stood up. She did not use notes. "Your Honor," she said, "we have no objection to the principle that the prenuptial agreement should be honored. We agree completely. We are here today because honoring the prenuptial agreement fully and accurately requires the court to first establish what each party actually brought into this marriage." Mercer was already shifting in his seat. Margaret continued, "The respondent submitted a financial disclosure at the time of signing that we believe was materially incomplete. We are not alleging deliberate fraud at this stage, Your Honor. We are asking the court to order a complete financial review to establish the full picture before any judgment is entered." Mercer was on his feet. "Your Honor, this is a fishing expedition designed to delay—" "Mr. Mercer," Judge Reeves said. "Just his name. That was all." He sat down. She looked at Margaret. "What specifically are you alleging was omitted?" Margaret opened her folder. "Your Honor, Nathan Caldwell's financial disclosure at the time of the prenuptial agreement listed 11 assets, including 3 real estate holdings, 2 investment accounts, and a primary residence. It did not include his ownership stake in a holding company called Harborview Capital Partners, LLC, which was registered in Delaware 6 months before the marriage, and in which Mr. Caldwell held a 31% ownership position." The room was very quiet. Judge Reeves looked at Mercer. "Counsel!" Mercer leaned toward his associate. They conferred in whispers. The associate was typing on a laptop. Mercer straightened. "Your Honor, we would need time to review—" "Is the asset real?" Judge Reeves asked. A pause. "Your Honor, there may have been an oversight in the original documentation. Mr. Mercer," the judge's voice was very level, "is the asset real?" A longer pause. "Yes, Your Honor." The temperature in the courtroom changed. Claire kept her eyes on her folder. She felt Adrian seated in the gallery directly behind her, and she felt the stillness of him, that deep-water stillness, and it steadied her. Judge Reeves made a note. "Continue, Ms. Cho," Margaret continued. She laid out the case for the financial review methodically, without drama, with the quiet authority of someone who had the facts on her side and knew that facts presented clearly did not need theatrical assistance. She outlined the discovered omission. She outlined the legal precedent for reviewing prenuptial agreements when disclosure had been incomplete. She outlined what a complete financial review would entail and the time frame she was proposing. Then she said, "Your Honor, we would also like to bring to the court's attention certain additional facts regarding the petitioner's own financial position at the time of signing." Mercer looked up. This was the part he hadn't been prepared for. Claire could see it in the way he leaned forward. He had been prepared for the Harborview Capital discovery. He had clearly known it was a risk and had a response ready, even if the response was inadequate. This was something else. This was new territory, and he knew it. The petitioner at the time of signing the prenuptial agreement disclosed a checking account balance of $11,000, a personal vehicle, and a student loan balance, Margaret said. She did not disclose the existence of a personal trust fund established in her name by the Whitmore Family Trust, which transferred to her direct control on her 25th birthday, 3 years prior to the marriage, and which has been professionally managed since that time. Mercer sat very still. "The current value of that trust," Margaret said, "is considerably in excess of what was disclosed in the original agreement." She named the figure. The sound that came from Nathan, not a word, not a sentence, just a short cut-off sound, was the most honest thing Claire had heard from him in years. It was the sound of a man whose entire framework for understanding a situation had just been removed from underneath him. His attorney grabbed his arm. Nathan shook him off. "She had—" He stopped himself. He looked at Mercer. His voice dropped, but it was not quiet enough. "She had that, and she never—" "Mr. Caldwell," Judge Reeves said sharply. Nathan closed his mouth, but his eyes went to Claire. For the first time all morning, he looked at her directly, not the managed, careful look of a man in a legal proceeding, but the look of someone who had just been turned completely inside out. She met his eyes. She held them for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked back at her folder. Judge Reeves set down her pen. "I'm going to call a 30-minute recess," she said. "Mr. Mercer, I strongly suggest you use that time to have a frank conversation with your client about how he wishes to proceed. Ms. Cho, I'll hear your full motion for financial review when we reconvene." She stood. Everyone stood. The gavel came down. The moment the judge left the bench, Mercer was on his feet and pulling Nathan toward the hallway. Claire watched them go, Mercer speaking rapidly, Nathan moving like a man who wasn't entirely sure where his legs were, and then she turned to Margaret. "That was the Harborview moment," Margaret said quietly, sitting beside her. "That was what changes the leverage entirely. They knew about that risk, but they didn't know about your trust. Combining them, the incompleteness on both sides gives the judge grounds to throw out the prenup entirely and order equitable distribution, which is a much, much more favorable framework for you." "What does equitable distribution look like in this situation?" Claire asked. "It means the court looks at everything, the whole picture of the marriage, both parties' contributions, both parties' assets, and divides it in a way that is fair. It means the prenup Nathan was planning to use as a weapon becomes largely irrelevant. It means Nathan Caldwell's financial situation, all of it goes under a microscope." Claire was quiet for a moment. "And if what Adrian found about the company structure becomes part of the court record during that process—" "It will," Margaret said. "It has to. A full financial review means exactly that. How bad will it be for him?" Margaret looked at her with the candor of a very good attorney being asked a question by a client she respected. "It depends on what the review turns up. If the company's situation is as your brother described, the public record of a court-ordered audit, even the existence of one announced in proceedings that reporters have access to will create problems for him with his lenders and his business partners. How serious those problems become depends on how many of his counterparties have been operating on faith in the image rather than analysis of the actual numbers." "How many do you think?" "Most of them," Margaret said simply. In the hallway, through the tall, narrow window set in the courtroom door, Claire could see Nathan and Mercer standing close together. Mercer was doing most of the talking. Nathan had his back against the wall and his head down and his arms crossed over his chest in the particular posture of a man receiving information that he does not want to receive but cannot argue with. She looked away. She thought about Victoria Hayes, who was not in this courtroom. She had not come. That told Claire something, though she wasn't sure exactly what. Perhaps Nathan had asked her to stay away. Perhaps she had chosen to stay away. Perhaps somewhere in the last 3 days, cracks had appeared in what Nathan had told her about how easily this would all go. The 30 minutes passed. People moved around the courtroom. Margaret's team reviewed documents. David Park, the financial specialist, made quiet notes. Adrian remained in the gallery, still present, watchful. When everyone reconvened, Nathan and Mercer sat back down. Nathan's posture had changed. The morning's careful composition was gone. He looked tired in the specific way that comes from the internal effort of managing information you can't yet process. Judge Reeves returned to the bench. "Ms. Cho, your motion for full financial review." Margaret stood and delivered it in 11 minutes. It was precise, documented, and airtight. She cited the Harborview omission. She cited the trust fund. She cited precedent for setting aside prenuptial agreements when disclosure had been materially incomplete on either side. She asked for a 60-day period for court-appointed financial review of both parties' full asset histories. When she sat down, Judge Reeves looked at Mercer. Response. Mercer stood. He was, Claire thought, a genuinely skilled attorney, and the fact that he was struggling was visible in a way it clearly hadn't been when the morning began. He made the arguments he had available that the trust fund omission was the petitioner's own responsibility, that the Harborview LLC was a minor oversight, that the prenup should be honored as written because that was the intent of both parties. I made those arguments competently. They were not enough. Judge Reeves let him finish. Then she said, "Mr. Mercer, the court finds that the financial disclosure on both sides of this agreement was materially incomplete. I am granting the motion for full financial review. I am appointing a court-designated financial examiner to review the full asset histories of both parties. Both parties will provide full cooperation and access. We will reconvene in 60 days. She looked at both tables. I want to be very clear that full means full. Any assets not previously disclosed will be discovered. Both parties should plan accordingly." She paused. "Is that understood by both counsel?" "Yes, Your Honor," Margaret said. A beat. "Mr. Mercer." "Yes, Your Honor," Mercer said. His voice was level, but it cost him something. The gavel came down again, and that was when it happened. As people began to stand and gather papers, as the formal structure of the proceeding dissolved into the informal movement of a courtroom. Between moments, Nathan Caldwell stood up and turned around. He wasn't looking at his attorney. He wasn't looking at the judge. He turned around and looked directly at Adrian Whitmore. Adrian was standing in the gallery, folding his jacket over his arm. He looked back at Nathan with the complete, steady neutrality of a man who was not angry and was not triumphant and was not performing anything at all. Nathan stared at him. "You did this," Nathan said. Not a question, not loud, but loud enough. Adrian looked at him for a moment. "She called me," Adrian said simply. "I came. You had no business." "She's my sister," Adrian said. The word sister landed in the room like something solid. "She called me at midnight with $37 and nowhere to sleep. What exactly did you expect me to do?" Nathan's jaw worked. Mercer had his hand on Nathan's arm. "Nathan, she never told me," Nathan said. And the thing that shocked Claire, standing close enough to hear all of this, was that underneath the anger in his voice, there was something that sounded almost like genuine. "You understand how insane that is?" "Yes," Adrian said. "I understand exactly. She wanted to be loved for herself. She wanted someone who saw her, not the name, not the money, just her." He paused. "And instead she got a man who handed her divorce papers and had security escort her out." Another pause. "So here we are." Nathan looked at Claire then. Really looked at her the way he hadn't in years, the way you look at something when you finally accept you've been looking at it wrong. "Claire," he started. "We can communicate through counsel," she said quietly. "That's what they're here for." She turned to Margaret and said something about the 60-day timeline. She made her voice normal and her hands still, and she breathed steadily while Nathan stood 6 feet behind her in a courtroom where everything he had planned for that morning had dissolved into something he would spend a long time reckoning with. Margaret gathered the last of the documents. David Park snapped his briefcase shut. The courtroom was emptying. Claire picked up her folder and her bag and walked to the door. In the corridor outside, Adrian caught up to her. He walked beside her without saying anything for a moment, the way he had always walked beside her when she needed the presence without the conversation. She was almost at the elevator before she spoke. "He genuinely didn't know," she said. "About the trust, no. He didn't. Not just the trust. He didn't know me, any of me. 7 years and he had absolutely no idea who I was." She pressed the elevator button. "I don't know if that makes it worse or better." "Both," Adrian said. "It's both." The elevator came. They stepped in. The doors closed. Claire stared at her reflection in the polished steel doors, the navy suit, the steady hands, the face of a woman who had walked into a room an hour ago and changed everything about what the next 60 days were going to look like for Nathan Caldwell. She didn't feel victorious. That was what surprised her. She had expected something. Relief, maybe, or satisfaction, or that particular sweetness that people talk about when they describe justice being served. What she felt instead was tired, and underneath the tired something quieter, something she needed a moment to identify. She identified it. It was freedom, not triumphant freedom, not the kind in movies with swelling music, the ordinary daily kind, the kind that settles in when a weight you've been carrying for so long that you forgot it was there is finally genuinely no longer attached to you. "What happens now?" she asked. 60 days, Adrian said. "The financial examiner goes in. Margaret manages the process. You don't have to be in a courtroom again until they reconvene." "And his business?" Adrian was quiet for a moment. The elevator reached the lobby and opened. They walked through the marble entrance hall and through the glass doors and out into the Seattle air. "He called 3 of his major lenders this morning," Adrian said once they were outside. "His assistant, not Victoria, his office assistant, called our firm's analyst, trying to gather information about what documents were filed. His communications team put out a brief statement about an hour ago saying the company is cooperating with all legal processes and that business operations are fully normal." Claire looked at him. "You're monitoring his communications?" "I'm monitoring publicly available information about his company's public statements," Adrian said carefully. "And I'm receiving updates from people who are watching his market position because those people work for me and his company operates in sectors I have interests in." Is the statement true? She asked. That operations are fully normal. The statement, Adrian said, is a statement. She understood. A statement was what you released when operations were not fully normal, but you needed the world to believe they were while you figured out what to do next. Adrian, she said. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. I meant what I said. I don't want him destroyed. I know. There are people who work for that company, employees who have nothing to do with what he did to me. If the whole thing collapses, the court-appointed examiner's job is to establish facts, Adrian said, not to destroy. If the facts are damaging, that's the consequence of the facts being what they are not, of us having revealed them. There's a difference. Is there? Yes, he said. There is. He looked at her directly. You didn't create his debt structure. You didn't hide his assets. You didn't build a financial house of cards and then dress it up to look like a mansion. He did those things. The examiner is going to find what's there because it's there. That's not destruction. That's daylight. She held his eyes for a moment. Daylight, she said. That's all it is. She breathed in the cold Seattle air. She looked up at the sky, which was the kind of flat gray that sometimes in this city gave way to something unexpectedly clear. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. It was a text from a number she didn't recognize, and it said, "Only, I need to talk to you. It's about Nathan. It's important. Please." V. She stared at the text. V. Victoria. She showed it to Adrian without a word. He read it. His expression didn't change. He looked at her. Your call, he said. She thought about what she had said in the hotel suite 2 nights ago, that Victoria was not the villain, that she was a 28-year-old woman who had gotten mixed up with a man who lies. She thought about what that might mean, what a 28-year-old woman who was pregnant and who had just watched the morning Nathan had presumably described to her as simple and quick turn into something entirely different might be sitting with right now, what she might need to say, what she might know. She thought about it for a long moment. Then she typed back, "Where are you?" The response came in 40 seconds. A coffee shop, 2 blocks from the courthouse. She looked at Adrian. "Walk with me," she said. He fell into step beside her without asking where they were going. He knew her well enough. He always had. They walked 2 blocks. They pushed open the door of a small coffee shop on 2nd Avenue. It was warm inside and smelled like espresso and pastry and the ordinary comfort of a place that had nothing to do with courts or money or people performing the best or worst versions of themselves. Victoria Hayes was in the back corner. She was wearing a gray coat. She was 28 years old, and she was clearly pregnant further along than Claire had expected, and she had been crying recently, not dramatically, but the particular redness around the eyes that comes from quiet private crying that you've been doing for a while and trying not to show. She looked up when Claire and Adrian walked in. Something moved across her face that Claire couldn't entirely name. Relief, maybe. Fear. The particular vulnerability of a person who has asked for something they're not sure they deserve to receive. Claire sat down across from her. Adrian went to the counter and ordered coffees and gave them space. Victoria looked at her hands. "I know you don't owe me anything," she said. "No," Claire agreed. "I don't. I didn't come here to ask you for anything. I came because—" She stopped. She gathered herself. "Because there are things Nathan told me that I'm realizing aren't true, and there are things about his company that he has told me are fine that I don't think are fine, and I'm—" She put her hand briefly on her stomach, then moved it away, self-conscious. "I'm trying to figure out what I'm actually standing on." Claire looked at her. She looked at this young woman in the gray coat trying to figure out what she was standing on, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. She felt recognition. "What do you know?" Claire asked quietly. Victoria looked up, and then she started talking. She talked for 20 minutes. She told Claire about conversations she had overheard in the office over the last year. About calls Nathan had taken behind closed doors that he'd explained away in terms that didn't quite make sense. About a meeting 3 months ago with 2 men she'd never seen before who left Nathan visibly shaken, though he'd said nothing about it. About financial documents she had been asked to file that had entries that didn't match other documents she'd seen. She was not a financial expert. She was an assistant who had been paying attention. But sometimes the most useful witness is the person who was in the room every day and noticed things without knowing exactly what they meant. When she finished the coffee Adrian had brought sat untouched and cooling in front of both of them. Claire looked at her. "Are you willing to speak with my attorney?" she asked. Victoria's hands tightened in her lap. Is it going to make things worse for—" She stopped. She looked at Claire with the candid helplessness of someone who still had feelings for a person, even while understanding those feelings had led her somewhere bad. For him? Claire thought about how to answer that honestly. "It's going to put more truth in the room," she said finally. "What happens to Nathan depends on what Nathan has actually done. What you know doesn't change what he did. It just helps the people who need to understand it more clearly." Victoria was quiet for a long time. Then she nodded. One small nod. "Okay," she said. Claire pulled out her phone and texted Margaret. She looked up at Victoria. "She'll meet you this afternoon," she said. "Wherever is comfortable for you." Victoria nodded again. She looked at her hands. She looked up at Claire. "I'm sorry," she said. "For my part in this, I believed what he told me." Claire looked at her for a moment. "I know," she said. "So did I for a long time." She stood. She straightened her jacket. She looked at this young woman who was about to have a child and who was sitting in a coffee shop trying to figure out what was real and what wasn't, and she understood her in a way that had nothing to do with anger, and everything to do with the simple, complicated fact that people are more than the worst moments they participate in. "Take care of yourself," Claire said. She walked back to where Adrian was standing near the door. He looked at her face and read it the way he had always been able to read her face. "Well," he said. "She knows things," Claire said. "Margaret needs to talk to her today." He nodded. He was already pulling out his phone. They walked back out into the Seattle air. The flat gray sky had not, as it turned out, given way to something clearer, but it was brighter than it had been in the specific way that November in Seattle sometimes surprised you, not warmth, not sun, but a lightning. A small, honest lightning. In 60 days, a court-appointed examiner would open the books of Caldwell Real Estate Group and begin the process of finding out what was actually there. In 60 days, Nathan Caldwell would have to sit across from facts he had spent years carefully managing the distance between himself and... But that was 60 days from now. Today, Claire had walked into a courtroom as the woman Nathan thought he had already defeated, and she had walked out as something he was only beginning to understand he had completely failed to see. That was enough for one day. That was, in fact, more than enough. The 60 days that followed were the quietest and the loudest of Claire's life simultaneously. Quiet because she wasn't in a courtroom. Quiet because the formal machinery of the legal process had taken over, and her role for the moment was to cooperate with the examiner, answer questions when asked, and let Margaret manage the procedural landscape, while David Park and his team worked through numbers in a downtown office they had rented for the duration of the review. Loud because the world, as it turned out, does not stay still when a court-appointed financial examiner starts asking questions about a company that a lot of people have a lot of money tied to. The first sign came on day 6. Claire was in the temporary apartment Adrian had arranged for her, a furnished place in Capitol Hill 3 blocks from where she and Nathan had lived early in their marriage, which she suspected was Adrian's quiet way of telling her she could reclaim that neighborhood too when Margaret called at 7:41 in the morning. "Harborview Capital Partners just filed for dissolution," Margaret said. Claire set down her coffee. "Nathan's holding company. The one he didn't disclose in the prenup. Yes, his attorneys filed the paperwork 2 days ago, apparently hoping to resolve it quietly before the examiner got there. The examiner got there first. The filing is now part of the public record, and 3 financial journalists have already picked it up." Claire was quiet for a moment. "What does this mean for the review?" "It means the examiner now has documentation of an asset that was being actively unwound during an active court proceeding. That is not a good look. It is also not technically obstruction, but it is the kind of thing that makes a financial examiner look at everything else with considerably more attention. And the journalists—" "The first story ran online about 40 minutes ago," Margaret said. "Seattle Business Journal. It's careful. It mentions the dissolution and notes that Caldwell Real Estate Group is currently subject to a court-ordered financial review in the context of divorce proceedings. That's all it says, but that's enough." Claire knew what enough meant. She had grown up watching her father manage the way that information moved through financial communities. A story didn't need to say much. It just needed to say something, and then the people who already had questions but had been giving the benefit of the doubt would stop giving it, and the people who monitored these things professionally would start looking more carefully, and the lenders who had covenant clauses would pull out their files and start running numbers. A story just needed to be there. The rest happened on its own. "How is he?" she asked, and then immediately felt strange for asking. Margaret paused briefly. "From what our contacts indicate, he's been in his attorney's office since 6 this morning. His communications director has been told to say nothing beyond the prepared statement. His CFO requested an urgent internal meeting yesterday that Nathan attended with both his attorneys present." "That's not good for him." "No," Margaret said. "It's not." After she hung up, Claire sat with her coffee for a long moment and thought about what she felt. She had told herself and Adrian and Margaret that she didn't want Nathan destroyed. She had meant it. She still meant it. But meaning something and feeling nothing complicated about its consequences were two very different things, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that they were different. She thought about this man she had married, not the man in the courtroom last week, and not the man at the bar with the bourbon and the divorce papers. She thought about the man from the library fundraiser 10 years ago, the man who had looked at her across a crowded room like she was the most interesting person in it. She thought about whether that man had been real or a performance, and she thought that the honest answer was probably somewhere in between, which was the most complicated place any answer could live. She got up, she got dressed, she went to work. Because Claire Whitmore, even in the middle of all of this, had work to do. 3 weeks before Nathan had handed her those divorce papers, she had begun consulting with a nonprofit organization that provided legal and social services to low-income Seattle residents. The kind of services that the library regulars she had known for years often desperately needed and had no idea how to access. She had started it quietly, using a small portion of the trust income she had never touched, meeting with the organization's director on Tuesday afternoons after her library shifts. Nathan had known she was doing nonprofit consulting. He had called it her little project with the specific brand of dismissiveness that she had long ago learned to move past without comment. Her little project, it turned out, was considerably larger than he had imagined, because Claire had been doing considerably more than consulting. She had been planning. The community center had been her idea for 2 years. A space where people could access legal aid, financial counseling, job training, crisis, support the full range of services that the library, which she loved, could gesture toward but not provide. She had a site identified. She had an architect who had done pro bono work on the preliminary plans. She had conversations begun with 6 social service organizations about co-locating in the space. She had all of this before Nathan handed her the divorce papers. She had just been waiting for the moment to move from planning to doing, and the moment it turned out had found her. On day 11 of the 60-day review period, she met with the architect for 3 hours. On day 14, she sat down with the director of a legal aid organization and 2 other nonprofit leaders and talked about structure and funding and governance in the specific detailed way that people who have grown up watching large institutions operate talk about such things when they stop pretending they don't know how. On day 19, she called her father. That conversation was 20 minutes long, and she had been putting it off for 2 weeks, and it was both harder and easier than she expected. Her father, Robert Whitmore, 71 years old, still sharp, still formidable, still capable of making her feel simultaneously like a child and appear in the same sentence, listened to the entire situation without interrupting. He did not say, "I told you so," which she had braced for. He did not say, "I knew something was wrong with him," which she had also braced for. He said after a long pause, "Are you all right?" And she said, "Yes, I think I actually am." And he said, "Adrian tells me you've started the community center project." "Adrian talks too much," she said. "Adrian is proud of you," her father said. "So am I. I always was. You should have known that. I should have said it more clearly." Another pause. "Do you need anything from me?" She thought about it. She thought about what she needed from her father at 61 years old, having been gone for 10 years, and having come back not to the family, but to herself. "Come visit," she said. "When this is all settled, come see what I'm building." He was quiet for a moment. She could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, somewhere in the Connecticut house where she had grown up. "I'll be on the next plane," he said. She smiled for the first time in what felt like a long time. On day 23, Nathan called. Not through his attorneys, not through Margaret. He called her direct cell phone, the new one, which meant he had gotten the number somewhere, probably through a mutual contact at 8:15 on a Tuesday evening. She stared at the name on the screen for 4 rings before she answered. "I need 15 minutes, he said. "Nathan." Please. The word sounded strange in his mouth. Nathan Caldwell was not a man who said please in the particular way that meant it. He had always said it in the social way, the transactional way, the way that was really just courtesy rather than asking. This was different. This was a man with his back against something and nowhere left to perform toward. She should have said no. Margaret would have said no. Adrian would have said nothing, which meant the same thing. She said 15 minutes, Thursday, 2 o'clock. You come to my attorney's office. Margaret will be present. A pause. That's the offer, Nathan. He came. Thursday at 2 o'clock, Nathan Caldwell walked into Margaret Cho's downtown office, looking like a man who had aged 5 years in 3 weeks. He was still put together, the suit, the grooming, the surface maintenance, but underneath the surface there was something that hadn't been there before. A kind of reality that happens to people when the stories they've been telling collapse and they're left standing in what's actually true. He sat across the table from Claire and Margaret. He didn't have Mercer with him. He had requested this be off the record between them personally, and Margaret had agreed with the quiet understanding that nothing that happened in her office was ever truly off anything. He looked at Claire for a moment before he spoke. The examiner found things, he said. I assumed they would, she said. It's worse than... He stopped. He pressed his hands flat on the table. I made decisions over the last several years that I believed were strategic. I believed I was managing risk in a way that was sophisticated. What I understand now, having had people go through it with me in the last 3 weeks, is that I was managing my own perception of the risk more than the actual risk itself. Margaret said nothing. Claire said nothing. The company has significant debt exposure, Nathan said, more than what's publicly visible. 2 of my major lenders have already been in contact since the Harborview story ran. One of them has invoked a covenant clause. He paused. I'm looking at a situation where the company as it currently exists may not survive the next 6 months without significant restructuring. Claire looked at him. She thought about the employees. She thought about what she had said to Adrian about not wanting people who had nothing to do with this to bear the consequences. What are you asking for? She said. He looked at her. I'm not sure I deserve to ask for anything. That's not what I asked. I was quiet for a moment. I want to know if there is any version of this where I can restructure the company without the court proceedings becoming the story that follows every conversation I have with every potential partner or investor for the next 5 years. Margaret leaned forward slightly. The court proceedings are public record, Mr. Caldwell. That can't be changed. I know, he said. I know that. He looked at Claire. I want to know if you're going to push. If your brother's people are going to push. If this is going to become something that's designed to... I told you in this courtroom, Claire said quietly, that we could communicate through counsel. I'm going to tell you something now that I mean, and I want you to hear it clearly. She held his eyes. I am not interested in destroying you. I never was. What I want is the truth to be in the record. What I want is for the prenuptial agreement to be applied to the actual facts of our marriage, both sides of those facts. What I want is what's fair. She paused. What I don't want is for you to walk away from 7 years believing that you set the terms. He held her gaze. Something in his face moved, not the performance of emotion, but the actual thing. The real, uncomfortable, private thing that happens when someone finally hears something true. The trust fund, he said. You had all of that and you never... I wanted to be chosen for myself, she said. It was the same thing she had told Adrian in the hotel suite, and it landed the same way, simply completely without apology. I wanted to know that what we were building was real, not because of my name or my money, because of who I actually was. Nathan looked at his hands. I didn't know who you actually were, he said. No, she agreed. You didn't. And that is something I have thought about every day for 3 weeks, Nathan. Whether that was my fault for not telling you or yours for never asking. She paused. I think it was both. I think we both failed at seeing each other, but only one of us threw the other one out in the rain. The room was very quiet. Nathan's hands were still flat on the table. He looked at them for a long moment. What happens to the company? He said slowly. If the examiner's report goes into the full record, realistically, what happens? Margaret answered. She was precise and thorough, the way she always was. She walked him through the realistic sequence, the public filing, the likely lender responses, the potential for regulatory attention if certain accounting practices were flagged, the timeline. She did not soften it, but she did not dramatize it. She gave him the truth in the clear, direct language of someone who respected him enough not to manage his understanding of his own situation. When she finished, Nathan sat back in his chair. He was quiet for what felt like a full minute. Then he said, "What if I cooperate fully, with the examiner, with everything? What if I stop trying to manage it and just let it be what it is?" Margaret looked at him. "That would be in your interest regardless of anything else." "I know," he said. "I know that now." He looked at Claire. What if there were a settlement agreement? One that didn't require the full court proceeding to play out. One that acknowledged— He stopped. He chose his words. That the prenup wasn't the whole picture. Margaret and Claire exchanged a look. A brief professional look that said several things in no language Nathan could read. "That conversation needs to happen through counsel," Margaret said. "Formally, with your attorney present." Nathan nodded. "I know." He stood up. He was going to say something. Claire could see him forming it the same way she had always been able to see him forming the thing he was about to say, the small gathering of intention before words. She had read that particular tell for 7 years without ever knowing she was reading it. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the way I did it. The papers, the security, the—" He stopped. "You deserved better than that. Whatever else was true, you deserved better than that." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "I did." He left. Margaret turned to Claire the moment the door closed. "That was a man who has spoken to his attorney this morning and been told that cooperation is the only viable path forward," Margaret said. "I want you to be clear about that." "I know," Claire said. "The apology is real and it isn't," Margaret said. "Both things are true." "I know that too," Claire said. Margaret looked at her for a moment. "How do you feel?" Claire thought about it. She was careful about the question, the way she was careful about questions that mattered. "Like I needed to hear it," she said finally, "and like it doesn't change anything fundamental, and like both of those things are okay." Margaret nodded. She picked up her pen. "All right, let's talk about the settlement framework." The settlement negotiations took 11 more days. They were conducted entirely through attorneys, which was the right way, the clean way, the way that kept emotion from contaminating what needed to be a functional process. Mercer negotiated for Nathan with the particular energy of a man who understood the field had shifted and was trying to protect as much ground as possible given the new terrain. Margaret negotiated for Claire with the quiet precision of a woman who knew exactly what the facts supported and wasn't asking for a cent more. The agreement they reached was, as Margaret described it, equitable. It acknowledged that the prenuptial agreement had been signed under conditions of incomplete disclosure on both sides. It established a fair division of the marital assets accumulated during the 7 years of the marriage. It did not attempt to reach Claire's personal trust because the prenup's own logic applied correctly protected her separate property, and it did not attempt to bleed Nathan's company beyond what the marriage itself had contributed to its position. It was fair, not generous, not punishing, fair. Claire signed it on a Thursday morning at 10:04 in Margaret's office with Adrian sitting beside her and Margaret across the table and a notary public standing at the end of the room with the patient neutrality of someone who witnesses the endings of things for a living. She signed her name clearly, Claire Whitmore. She put the pen down. She looked at her signature on the document and felt the specific completeness of a thing that has been long and difficult and is now finally done. "Congratulations," Margaret said with the particular warmth of a professional who has been through something real with a client and means it. "Thank you," Claire said, "for everything." Adrian said nothing. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder. She put her hand over his for a moment. Then she stood up. She straightened her jacket. She picked up her bag. She had somewhere to be. The community center site was a former warehouse space in the Central District, 12,000 square feet that had been vacant for 2 years and that Claire had found through a contact at the city planning office who had been trying to get something useful into that building for longer than that. The lease was signed in Claire's name. The architect had delivered revised plans the previous week. The first of the social service organizations scheduled to co-locate had sent their letter of intent. She arrived at the building at 11:15. Her phone was ringing before she got inside. It was a number she recognized. She stared at it for a moment. Then she answered. "Victoria," she said, "I saw the news about the settlement." Victoria's voice was careful, restrained. She had been doing a lot of restraining lately, Claire suspected. I wanted to say something." "How are you?" Claire asked. A pause. The surprise in the pause was audible. "I'm okay. I'm not great. Nathan and I are—" She stopped. "We're not in a good place. He's dealing with a lot, and I'm dealing with another stop. Being 7 months pregnant and not sure what any of this looks like." Claire was quiet for a moment. "Do you have support?" she asked. "People around you. My mom is coming next week." "Good." She meant it. She meant it simply and completely, which was not something she would have expected 3 weeks ago, and was now just what was true. "I don't know why I called," Victoria said. "I think I wanted you to know that I know you didn't have to be decent about any of this. About me. And you were. And I—" A longer pause. "I'm not going to forget that." Claire looked at the empty warehouse in front of her. The raw space, the bare floors, the walls that would become rooms, that would become services, that would become, for some number of people in this city, the difference between managing and not managing. "Take care of yourself," she said to Victoria. "Take care of that baby." She hung up. She walked into the building. The architect was already there with 2 members of his team. He had spread plans across a folding table. He'd brought in detailed drawings, room layouts, traffic flow studies, the whole future of the space rendered in lines and measurements. He looked up when she came in. "The permits came through this morning," he said. "We can break ground in 30 days. She stopped in the middle of the empty floor. 30 days ago, she had been standing on the sidewalk outside a tower in the rain with a broken suitcase and $37. 30 days ago, Nathan Caldwell had handed her papers and watched security escort her to the elevator and told himself it was simple, that she was simple, that this would be over quickly and cleanly and without consequence. And now she was standing in a building she was going to fill with something real. She looked at the plans on the table. She looked at the walls that weren't walls, yet the rooms that were still just ideas in someone's drawings. She looked at the ceiling and the floor and the big, empty middle of a space that was about to become something. 30 days, she said. "Give or take," the architect said. She nodded. She walked to the table and looked at the plans and started asking questions. Specific, detailed, informed questions about load-bearing walls and traffic patterns and the placement of services and the acoustic separation between spaces, where different kinds of conversations would need to happen. The architect answered. His team took notes. Outside. Nathan Caldwell was sitting in his attorney's office going through the terms of a restructuring agreement with 2 creditors who had decided that cooperation was preferable to the alternative. His CFO was there. His communications director was there. The Harborview LLC was fully dissolved. The company was smaller than it had been 3 weeks ago, and it was going to become smaller still before it became stable, and the image of the successful developer who had built himself from nothing was in the process of being replaced by something more honest and considerably more modest. He had made a choice in the end that Claire had offered him in Margaret's office to stop managing the story and let it be what it was. That choice would not save everything. It would not restore what had already cracked. But it would allow some smaller, truer version of the company to survive. And the people who worked for it would most of them keep their jobs through the restructuring, which was the thing Claire had cared about most, and the thing she was glad quietly and privately to know. Back in the warehouse, she was on her 3rd set of questions about the main service hub layout when her phone buzzed with a text from Adrian. It said, "Dad's flight lands Friday. He wants to see the building." She looked at the text and felt something warm move through her chest. She typed back, "Tell him to bring his reading glasses. The plans are detailed." 3 dots appeared. Then, "He says he's bringing his checkbook too. Should I tell him you'll say no?" She almost laughed out loud there in the middle of the empty warehouse with the architect and his team looking at her with polite curiosity. She typed, "Tell him I'll say yes to whatever makes sense and no to everything else. Same as always." She put the phone in her pocket. She turned back to the plans. She had a community center to build. And for the first time in 7 years, maybe longer, she was building something that was entirely, completely without qualification hers. Not because no one else had a stake in it. Not because she didn't have partners and funders and a team of people who would help make it real. But because the vision was hers. The purpose was hers. The understanding of why it mattered, the memory of being a woman at a community library who watched people come in every day looking for things they needed and leaving without them because the resources didn't exist. That was hers. Nobody had given it to her. Nobody had shaped it to fit their idea of what she should be doing with herself. Nobody had called it her little project. It was hers, and in 30 days they would break ground, and after that the work would really begin. She leaned over the table and looked at the plans with the focused, fully present attention of a woman who had come a very long way to get here and intended to arrive completely. The groundbreaking happened on a Tuesday. It was not a big event. Claire had specifically asked that it not be. No press release, no ribbon, no city council member in a hard hat making a speech about community investment. Just the architect, the contractor, the 6 organizational partners who would co-locate in the space, and a small crew of workers who were ready to begin the actual work the moment the formalities were done. Adrian came. He stood to her left in the cold morning air, hands in his coat pockets, watching his sister hold a ceremonial shovel with the particular expression of a man who had watched her become herself and was not going to make a speech about it because some things are too real for speeches. Her father came. Robert Whitmore was 71 years old, and he had flown across the country, and he was standing to her right, and he was not a man who cried, had never been a man who cried. But when Claire drove the shovel into the earth and turned the first dirt, and looked up, she saw something in his face that she had not seen there in a long time. Pride, clean and simple and without condition. She handed the shovel to the contractor. She brushed the dirt from her gloves. She turned to her father, and he put his arms around her and held her the way he had held her when she was small, before the expectations and the estate and the weight of being a Whitmore had complicated everything between them, and she let him. "I should have told you more clearly," he said into her hair. The same thing he had said on the phone. He needed to say it in person, she understood. Some things need a body behind them to land properly. "You're here now," she said. That was enough. It was genuinely enough. She had learned in the last several months that enough was not a lesser standard. Enough was sometimes the exact right amount of a thing. The workers moved in, the machinery started up, the building began to become what it was going to be. Robert Whitmore spent 4 days in Seattle. On the first day, Claire took him through the building and walked him through the plans with the same focused detail she had used with the architect. He asked good questions. He had always asked good questions even when she was too young to appreciate that quality in him. He asked about the governance structure, the funding model, the long-term sustainability, the relationship with the city, the criteria for the organizations co-locating. He asked the way a man asks who has been running large institutions for 40 years and knows exactly which questions reveal whether something is real or just visionary. Everything she answered was real. He knew it. She watched him know it over the course of the morning, the incremental settling of whatever concern he had carried onto the plane, giving way to something that looked like genuine respect between 2 people who happened to also be family. On the 3rd evening they had dinner, just the 2 of them. A quiet restaurant in Capitol Hill that she had chosen because she knew it from her library, years from the neighborhood that had been hers before it was anything else. She ordered what she always ordered. Her father looked at the menu for 2 minutes and then put it down and said he'd have whatever she was having, which she knew was his way of saying he was following her lead and was glad to be. They talked for 3 hours. They talked about things they had not talked about in years. Her mother, who had been gone for 8 years and whose absence was still a particular shape in both their lives. They talked about Adrian and the company and the weight of legacy that Adrian carried so consistently and so quietly that people sometimes forgot it was a weight at all. They talked about the 10 years she had been in Seattle and what she had been building and what had gone wrong and what had, despite everything, gone right. At some point, her father said, "When you left, I thought I had failed you." She looked at him. "I thought you needed to run because we had built something suffocating," he said. "I thought the life we had given you was something you were escaping from." "It wasn't that simple," she said. "I know that now." He turned his wine glass slowly. "But I spent a long time believing it, and I didn't call because I thought calling was reaching back in to pull you into something you needed distance from. I thought respecting you meant staying away." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't call because I thought calling meant admitting I couldn't do it on my own," she said. "I thought needing family meant I had failed at independence." They looked at each other across the table. "We are very stubborn people," her father said. "Yes," she agreed. "We are." He smiled. It was the particular smile she remembered from childhood, rare, real worth waiting for. "Don't be as stubborn as me," he said. "It wastes time." She thought about Nathan, about 7 years of waiting for someone to see her, about the way she had mistaken endurance for strength and staying for commitment and silence for wisdom, about all the ways that stubbornness can dress itself up and convince you it's something more useful than it is. "I'm working on it," she said. He reached across the table and briefly covered her hand with his, the same way Adrian had done in the hotel suite on that first morning, and she thought that there was something in that gesture, in that particular brief, wordless contact, that was the clearest form of love she knew. Not declarations, not grand displays, just the simple physical fact of presence. "I am here. You are not alone. Whatever comes next, we face it in the same direction." She squeezed his hand once. Then they finished dinner and talked about other things, lighter things, and the evening moved toward its end with the gentle, unhurried quality of time spent in a place where you don't need to perform anything. He flew back to Connecticut on Friday morning. Standing at the departure's entrance, he hugged her again, and then he held her by the shoulders and looked at her, the way he had looked at her when she was a child, and he was trying to tell her something important without finding the exact right words. "Come home for Christmas," he said. "Both of you. Adrian has already said yes. I'm asking you." She had not been back to the Connecticut house in 10 years. She had not been back since the night she sat at that dinner table and told Adrian she needed to find out who she was on her own. She knew now. She had found out. "Yes," she said. "I'll be there." The construction moved fast once it began. The contractor Claire had hired was a woman named Rosa, who had built out non-profit spaces across the Pacific Northwest for 20 years, and who ran her crews with a combination of absolute precision and genuine warmth that Claire recognized immediately as the specific leadership style of someone who had spent a long time figuring out how to get the best out of people by respecting them. Rosa and Claire understood each other within the first week. They had the same fundamental approach to problems. Look at what's actually there, determine what it requires, apply the resources you have as efficiently and honestly as possible, and don't let the gap between where you are and where you want to be convince you the project isn't worth doing. They met every Monday morning at 7:30. They walked the site. They talked about the week ahead. They made decisions in the fast, practical way of two people who trusted each other's judgment and didn't need to circle every question 4 times before landing on an answer. By week 6, the main structural work was complete. By week 8, the interior framing was done. By week 10, the organizations that would share the space were sending their teams in for planning meetings, and the building had that particular charged energy of something in the process of becoming real. Claire was there most mornings, not because she needed to supervise. Rosa had that handled completely, but because she needed to be present. She needed to watch it happen. She had spent too much of the last decade on the periphery of her own life, and she was not going to do that with this. It was on a Wednesday morning in week 9 that she ran into Nathan. Not by design, not by anything except the ordinary, slightly absurd coincidence that Seattle is a medium-sized city, and some neighborhoods have only so many coffee shops worth walking to before work. She was coming out of the place on Pine Street she'd been going to for years, the one with the barista who knew her order before she got to the counter and he was going in. They stopped. 3 feet of sidewalk between them and the whole architecture of the last several months settling into the air like weather. He looked different. Not worse exactly, but different. The specific polish of the Nathan Caldwell she had known, the grooming and the posture and the performed confidence was less thick. He looked more like a person, more like a man who was living with the consequences of real things rather than managing the image of a life that wasn't exactly what it appeared. "Claire," he said. "Nathan," she said. A pause. The pause had a lot in it. 7 years of marriage, 60 days of legal proceedings, a settlement signed on a Thursday morning, a courtroom where everything changed. All of it was in the pause, and somehow none of it was unbearable. "How's the building coming?" he said. She looked at him. She hadn't expected that question. Of all the things he might have asked, of all the conversational territory available to them, the fact that he had chosen to ask about the community center was something she hadn't prepared for. "Well," she said, "really well. We open in 6 weeks." He nodded. He seemed to be choosing his next words carefully. "I heard about the legal aid partnership from a contact who works in that sector. He mentioned it and then mentioned your name, and He paused. "I looked up what you were building. Online. I read about it." She said nothing. She waited. "It's a good thing," he said. "It's a genuinely good thing, Claire. I wanted you to know that He stopped. He tried again. "I know I don't get credit for what you're doing. I know I don't get to have a reaction to it that matters. But He looked at her with something that was not asking for anything and not performing anything, just a man being straightforwardly honest at 8:15 in the morning on a sidewalk. "I'm glad you're building it." She looked at him for a moment. "How's the restructuring?" she asked. "Hard," he said. "Harder than I imagined, but it's—" He made a small movement with his hand that wasn't quite a gesture and wasn't quite nothing. "It's more honest than what came before. I'll say that for it." She nodded slowly. "That's something." "It's something," he agreed. Another pause, this one shorter, easier. "Victoria had the baby," he said. She felt it, the thing that moved through her at those words. Not pain exactly, not anymore, something more complicated. The acknowledgement of a life she did not have and had thought she wanted, and now understood she had needed to not have in order to become what she was becoming. "Boy or girl?" she asked. "Girl," he said. Something moved across his face at that word, something that was entirely, purely real. "Her name is May." "That's a beautiful name," Claire said. She meant it. He looked at her for a moment longer. And then he said something she would think about later in the quiet of the evenings when she was alone with the work and her thoughts and the gradual understanding of who she was turning out to be. He said, "I never deserved you. I knew that somewhere. I think that's part of why I—" He stopped. "I think I was afraid of what you were underneath everything. The parts I could sense but couldn't see. I found it easier to diminish them than to understand them." She held his eyes. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me in 7 years," she said quietly. He flinched, just slightly. "I know," he said. She shifted her coffee cup to her other hand. She looked at this man who had been her husband and was now the person on the other side of a settlement agreement and would eventually just be someone she had known, one of the figures who populates the story of how you became yourself. "Take care of May," she said. "Be present for her, actually present. Not the version of present you were with me." He absorbed that. He let it land. "I'm trying," he said. "I'm genuinely trying." "I know," she said. And somehow she did know. She could see it in the different quality of his face. "Goodbye, Nathan." "Goodbye, Claire." She walked away. She didn't look back. Not because she was performing resolve, not because she needed to prove something to herself or to the universe, but simply because there was nothing behind her that she needed anymore. The direction that mattered was ahead of her, and ahead of her was the building and the work, and the thing she was building, and the woman she had spent 10 years and one rainy November night becoming. She went to the site. She stayed for 4 hours. The opening came on the first Friday of March. Seattle had given them a morning that was cold and clear in the particular way that felt in this city like a reward for having survived the winter. The sky was that pale, specific blue that appears sometimes in early spring and makes everything look a little sharper than usual. Claire had asked again for no fanfare. What she had gotten despite her asking was something she hadn't planned for. By 9 o'clock, the parking lot was full. People she had known from the library were there, Janet, who had been covering her shifts, and who had heard about the project from a colleague and had called 3 months ago to offer her time, was standing near the entrance in a coat Claire recognized. Rosa was there with her entire crew, still in work clothes, some of them because they had wanted to see what they'd built in use. The 6 organizational partners had brought their teams. The city council member whose office had helped with the permits had come without being asked and without bringing cameras, which Claire chose to take as evidence that occasionally people in city government did things because they were right. Adrian flew in the night before. He arrived at the opening in the same dark coat he'd worn in the hotel lobby the morning after Nathan threw her out, and seeing him in it gave Claire a moment of vertigo, the recognition of how much distance existed between that morning and this one, how much had been built in the space between. He stood beside her at the entrance as people began to come in. "How does it feel?" he asked. She looked at the people moving through the doors. She looked at the faces, the family that had come for the legal aid intake session, the woman with 2 children who had a financial counseling appointment scheduled, the young man who had registered for the job training program, the older couple who had heard about the housing assistance services from their church. Real people, with real things they needed, coming to a real place that was actually going to try to help them. "Like it matters," she said. Adrian nodded. He understood. He had always understood the things that mattered to her, even when she hadn't been able to say them clearly. "It does matter," he said. "It's going to matter to a lot of people." She nodded. She thought about the library and the afternoon light through the windows and the regulars who had trusted her to find them things. She thought about what she had been able to give people in that library and the wall she had always hit the moment when someone needed something the library couldn't provide and she had no place to send them. She thought about all the times she had watched people leave with an address on a piece of paper and a faint hope that the address would lead somewhere useful. This was the somewhere useful. She had built it. The morning moved. She greeted people. She introduced organizational leaders to each other. She sat in on the first 15 minutes of the legal aid intake session, not to supervise, but to see to witness the actual moment of connection between a resource and the person who needed it, which was the thing that had motivated all of this, and was now finally happening in real time in a building that had her name on the lease. At 11:30, Margaret Cho arrived. Claire saw her from across the room, the silver hair, the composed posture, the professional precision that was by now deeply familiar. Margaret walked toward her and looked around the space with the assessing eye of someone who notices things, and what she noticed, Claire could tell, was not just what was there, but what it had taken to get there. "I don't normally come to client events," Margaret said when she reached her. "I know," Claire said. "I'm glad you did." Margaret looked at her with something that was for Margaret Cho a notably warm expression. "You did something significant here," she said. "Not the legal work your brother pays for that. This." She gestured briefly at the room. "This is yours." "It is," Claire said. "I've been practicing family law for 32 years, Margaret said. "I don't say this to most clients, but you navigated something that could have made you smaller, and instead you let it make you larger. That's not common." Claire thought about it. She thought about the penthouse and the divorce papers and the taxi in the rain and the hotel suite and the courtroom and the coffee shop where Victoria had sat across from her with red eyes and a gray coat. She thought about all the moments between that night and this morning that had accumulated into something she hadn't planned and couldn't have engineered. "I had good people around me," she said. "You chose them," Margaret said. "That's also not nothing." She moved on. She had another appointment. She would always be Margaret Cho, precise and efficient and giving exactly the amount and no more. David Park, the financial specialist, who had flown in from New York at the beginning of all this, had sent a gift. Not to the opening, he was back in New York. There were other cases, other courtrooms, but a donation to the legal aid organization that had set up in the center in an amount that Claire found out about from the organization's director, and that made her stop for a moment in the middle of a conversation and register the specific quiet kindness of a person who had been professional and thorough and then gone one step further because they believed in the thing they had helped make possible. She would send him a note, a real one, handwritten. She still believed in handwritten notes. She probably always would. By midday, the building was running. Not at full capacity that would take months as programs built their intake processes and word spread through the communities they were trying to reach, and the ordinary slow work of trust building happened the only way it could, which was gradually and in person. But the structure was real, and the staff were in place, and the services were active, and people were walking in and being helped. That was enough. That was exactly, completely enough. She stepped outside for a moment. She needed air and a minute where nobody needed something from her, which was the necessary counterpart to having built a place where people came to get things they needed. She stood in the parking lot in the March cold and drank the coffee she'd been carrying around all morning and finally finished. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text from a number she didn't recognize. Short. It said, "I heard about the center. I think what you built is remarkable. I don't expect a response. I just wanted you to know that I know what it cost you to get here, and I know you anyway. Goodbye, Claire." She read it twice. She knew the number when she looked at it carefully. It was Nathan's personal cell, the one he'd used to call her that morning before the hearing, the one she'd told herself she wouldn't save in her contacts. She stood in the parking lot and read the message a third time. She didn't respond. There was nothing to respond to. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an opening. It was exactly what it said. It was a man choosing to say something true to someone he had wronged, not because it would change anything or earn him anything, but because the saying of it was what honesty required. She put her phone in her pocket. She stood in the cold air for another minute. She thought about what he had said. "I know what it cost you to get here." She thought about whether that was true, whether Nathan in the end actually understood what the cost had been, and she decided that it didn't matter whether he understood it completely. It didn't matter whether his understanding was precise or partial or filtered through his own particular version of events. What mattered was what she knew it had cost, and what she had gotten for the price, and whether it had been worth it. It had been worth it. Every single part of it had been worth it. She went back inside. The afternoon was full. She sat in on an intake session for the financial counseling program and watched a woman in her 50s, steady, careful, carrying the specific dignity of someone who had done hard things and was doing another one work through a situation she had been unable to address alone, and begin to understand that there were now people and tools and a place she could return to for support. Claire did not speak during the session. She sat to one side and she watched, and she thought about the words she had been using for years when she tried to explain to herself why the library had mattered so much, why this center mattered, why the specific work of connecting people to resources had always felt more important than it probably looked from the outside. The word was witness, being present for things, seeing people. Not managing them or performing for them or needing them to be something they weren't, but simply being there steadily and without agenda in a way that communicated you are seen, you are real, you are not alone in this room. That was what the library had given her the chance to do. That was what the center was built to do at scale with resources behind it. She had spent 7 years in a marriage with a man who had never once made her feel seen. She had spent the last several months learning what it felt like to finally be building something that was entirely, genuinely her own. The late afternoon came. The building settled into the rhythm of its first operational day. Rosa stopped in and walked through quickly and gave Claire a nod that said everything was holding together structurally, which in Rosa's language meant everything was exactly as it should be. Janet stopped her near the front and said, "I know you always thought the library was the realest thing you'd done, but Claire, this is it. This is the realest thing." Claire looked at her old colleague and felt the warmth of being known by someone who had watched you work and understood what you cared about and recognized it when they saw it. "Thank you," she said, and meant it completely. Adrian found her at 4:30, when most of the organizational staff had moved into their closing routines, and the day was winding toward its natural end. He had been there all day, moving quietly through the space, talking to people when people wanted to talk, leaving them alone when they didn't, being exactly the kind of present that was useful rather than performative. "Ready to go," he said. She looked around the space one more time. The building that had been an empty warehouse, the rooms that had been lines on paper, the people who had come in today and would come back tomorrow and would keep coming back because the thing she had built was real and useful and theirs. "Almost," she said. She walked to the center of the main hall and stood there for a moment. She thought about the girl who had come to Seattle wanting to find out who she was without the name and the money and the legacy. She had found out. It had taken 10 years and a rainy November night and a broken suitcase and a brother who got on a plane without being asked twice, and an attorney who negotiated with the precision of a surgeon, and the unexpected testimony of a young woman in a gray coat who had told the truth because it was the right thing to do. She had found out that she was the woman who built this. She was the woman who saw what was missing and decided to fill it, who chose kindness when cruelty was available and chose truth when comfort was offered, who had been thrown out of a penthouse with $37 and had used every resource, the internal ones and the external ones, the ones she had accumulated quietly over 10 years and the ones that came from the family. She had finally stopped being afraid to need to build something that would outlast every single moment that had tried to make her smaller. Nathan had told her she was leaving with nothing. He had been so wrong it was almost difficult to hold. She had left with herself, and herself, it turned out, had been more than enough to build everything that now existed around her. Adrian was waiting near the door. He had her coat over his arm. He held it out when she reached him. She put it on. The same olive green one she had worn the night she walked out of the penthouse. She had kept it deliberately. Not as a reminder of pain, she had no interest in maintaining pain as a souvenir, but as a reminder of the specific, irreversible truth that where you end up has almost nothing to do with where you started and everything to do with what you do next. She buttoned the coat. She picked up her bag. She and Adrian walked out of the building together into the early evening air of Seattle in March, and behind them, the lights of the center were on, and the last staff members were settling into the close of the first day, and ahead of them, the city was doing what cities do, moving, breathing, full of people, carrying things they needed, and looking for places that could help them find it. She had built one of those places. It would be open tomorrow. and the day after, and the day after that. The woman Nathan Caldwell had thrown away in the rain had become someone he never imagined built something he couldn't have conceived and walked away from everything he had done to her, carrying nothing but her own strength, and that in the end had been enough to change everything. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be seen by the person standing closest to them. Claire Whitmore had finally understood that the only person whose seeing had ever truly mattered was her own, and she saw herself clearly now, completely, without apology. That was the end of one story and the beginning of everything else.